Hello, scholars. This is Mr. Myers doing lesson 4.3 on elections in public opinion. Please take good structured notes over our objectives. We'll start by talking about the different kinds of elections, issue elections, and candidate elections, a little bit more about the specifics in terms of voting dates in Missouri, and then we're also going to talk about public opinion in this lesson. So there are two basic kinds of elections. One would be issue elections, where you're voting on some kind of issue or policy or program, and the other is candidate elections, where you're voting on a candidate or a person. In terms of issue elections, there's a couple different kinds, but almost all of them start with some kind of petition where citizens collect signatures in order to demonstrate that citizens want some kind of change. That petition could be submitted to the state legislature and ask the legislature to take up a law or an issue, or that petition could result in what's known as an initiative, and that's when enough signatures are garnered to allow for the issue to be put directly on the ballot, and the people would vote then directly on that particular initiative. This is a great way to bypass a state legislature if the state legislature is refusing to enact the will of the people. Now, in some ways, kind of the opposite of that is something called a referendum. And a referendum is when the state legislature decides to put an issue on the ballot and let the people directly vote for it, as opposed to them, voting and enacting a law. And this is a way to refer an issue back to the will of the people. Of course, initiative is citizen generated and the referendum is legislature generated, but both of them serve the purpose of allowing the people to vote directly on an issue. You can see the graphic on the right referring to Missouri voters amending the Missouri Constitution to allow for recreational marijuana. And both the medical marijuana and recreational marijuana movements all started with petitions. In terms of candidate elections, there are three different types. The primary, where Democrats compete for the Democratic nomination, Republicans compete for the Republican nomination, the Green Party candidates compete for the Green Party nomination. So these are basically elections within each actual party. The general elections then would be when those primary candidates win and then square off against each other. So the Democratic candidate and the Republican candidate would meet in the general election. A third kind is called a recall election. And a recall election is a way to remove an official before the next voting cycle happens if that official is doing something shady or egregious. This allows the people to remove that official, without having to wait, possibly 3 or 4 years for a term to end. So when do these elections happen? The presidential primary happens every 4 years. That's when the Republicans choose their party nominee and the Democrats choose their party nominee. And by February or March, usually a frontrunner has emerged in each of the fields, although sometimes it can be as late as June or July before it's obvious who is going to win each primary, but most of the time it's known in early spring. You have municipal and primary and general elections as well. Municipal elections are usually for mayors and city councils and school boards. Sometimes people do not run as a Democrat or a Republican in those kinds of elections, especially like school boards. And all of these elections happen on the first Tuesday after the first Monday. So make sure that you record that in your notes for the municipal, primary, and general elections. Now, one other thing to note about the primary elections at the local level. Oftentimes, and St. Louis City is a good example of this, when a city or a rural area is really dominated by either Democrats or Republicans, the primary is actually more important than the general election. For mayor of St. Louis, it is strongly likely the Democrat will beat the Republican candidate every time. So what really actually matters is the primary election, where the Democrats are largely determining who will ultimately win that nomination and then run in the general. Make sure you also note that the municipal elections happen in April, the primary in August, and the general in November, even though they all three follow the same formula of the first Tuesday after the first Monday. Okay, so a little bit about public opinion polling. First of all, I put public opinion polling in with elections just for convenience sake. It's its own topic, but I only had one slide I really needed to go over, so it's just largely for convenience. Well, let's talk a little bit about what the purpose is. The purpose of public opinion polling is to make sure that the people who are representing you know how the constituents feel. So this is important feedback in making sure your elected representatives know how the populace is feeling, knowing how their constituents are viewing various issues. It's kind of like taking the temperature of the people that you're supposed to be serving. Now, there's both a formal and an informal, way to kind of measure public opinion. The informal way is just by simply constituent contact. How many people have you talked to in your district that feel a particular way about a particular issue? If you've had 150 phone calls angry about a bill that's coming up and those people don't want you to vote for it, and you've only gotten 3 phone calls for people who want you to vote for it, that is kind of an informal, constituent contact way to clue in the elected official about maybe how they should vote. The other way is scientific polling, and this is a little bit trickier because there's lots of different factors that gets in the way of really accurate scientific polling. Every year, every election cycle, we hear that polling gets better, more scientific, more accurate. Though in the 2016 election, there were significant problems with polling that underrepresented the support for Donald Trump. And there are lots of different kind of analyses that have been enacted as to why that's the case. But it's an inexact science that's constantly being perfected. Some of the issues that you might want to note that might affect public opinion polling would be things like sample size. How big of a group of people did you sample? Was it truly representative of the constituency, of the population that's going to be voting for a candidate or an issue? Obviously, the bigger the sample size, the better. What about the wording of the questions that you're asking? You're going to get a very different response if you ask, do you support the murdering of babies versus do you support a woman's right to control her own body, right? So the way that the questions are worded are also very, very important. In addition, the time of day that you call and the day of the week that you call. If you call in the middle of the day, you might miss people who are at work. If you call on Sunday mornings, you're likely to miss people who are at church, who might be more conservative, and that might slant your polling, your public opinion polling more to the liberal side because you're missing out on some conservative voters, right? So the time of the day, whether or not you're calling on a landline or a cell phone, older folks have landlines, younger folks have cell phones. So if you're calling on landlines, you might underrepresent the youth vote. So all of those are issues that have to be looked at. Sample selection is related to sample size in that you want a large group of people that is diverse and representative of the again, district or the constituency. And then it's also important to note that when you're polling people, are they likely to actually go and vote? If you're measuring public opinion for a group of 100 people and 99 of them aren't going to vote, well then, it doesn't really matter all that much. So what you ideally want to do is to be able to effectively measure public opinion among likely voters, those that are likely, not only registered, right, but those that are likely to actually show up on the day of election. Okay, I hope you took good notes, and please bring any questions to class.